folks. Well, I think hello from Kingston. Oh, wow. Great to see a wide variety of people on the call today. So we are going to get going, and I'm just going to turn on, make sure we're recording. We are recording. Amazing. Okay, well, welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar to talk further about prioritization. And when I say further, because in 2020, OrgCode already did a great prioritization overview webinar as part of this by name list and coordinated access series. In this webinar, we're aiming to go a bit deeper. It's Prioritization 201, focusing on dynamic prioritization practices. So how to move beyond static prioritization to make your coordinated access and prioritization processes more dynamic and responsive within your local context. We get lots of questions about prioritization as people work to create their prioritization policies and practices. So hoping this webinar is going to help answer some of those questions. My name is Morrison. I am the Director of Built for Zero Canada with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and I am your host and one half of the presentation team for today's webinar. My co-presenter is none other than Iain Jong, President and CEO of OrgCode Consulting, who is both an expert and a lifelong learner in the work to end homelessness. We will begin with a land acknowledgement. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. I am located in Kitchener, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Neutral peoples, whose presence on these lands continues to this day. And Iain, I'll let you say hi and also do your land acknowledgement.
Very good day to everybody. I am currently situated on the treaty lands and traditional territory of the Mississaugas, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, and Haudenosaunee. We acknowledge the Indigenous people whose footsteps have marked this land for time immemorial.
Wonderful, thank you. This webinar is being brought to you today from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, which leads a national movement of individuals, organizations, and communities working together to end homelessness in Canada, and includes the 5 key initiatives that you see here. And this webinar is part of a series of monthly webinars and community practice calls through the Canadian Alliance taking place between the fall of 2019 and March of 2022. And we thank OrgCode for being a presenter for a number of these webinars. The calendar for January to March of 2022 will be released in the next few weeks. You can find all webinars and community practice calls, both those coming up and previous ones, on the Canadian Alliance Training and Technical Assistance website. This by name list and coordinated access support for communities is funded in part by the Government of Canada through the CCI funding stream of Reaching Home. So thank you to them. And just a bit of housekeeping before we jump into our topic today. This call is being recorded and it will be sent out within a few days to all those who have registered. It will also be posted on the Training and Technical Assistance website that I just showed you. Closed captioning should be enabled, so you can choose to view that or not. Everyone is muted. You can ask questions through the chat or question function throughout, and we're going to definitely have some time at the end for questions and discussion. And everyone's really also encouraged to use the chat to reflect on and highlight what you're hearing, to share ideas or share what is happening in your community. So let's get started. We'll jump into our topic on growing and nurturing our understanding of prioritization. And I'll now turn it over to Iain to get us started by grounding us in the what and the why of prioritization.
Thanks, Marie. And again, good day, everybody. Let's start with examining what coordinated access is, because we can't have a conversation about prioritization or even dynamic prioritization without going back to the roots of what we're actually being asked to do. So the first thing that we're being asked to do is to bring consistency to the process. The process of what? The process how people get access to housing and services. And that happens within a geographic area. Usually, you know, if you're a CBO, if you're a service manager, if you have those sorts of functions, the geographic boundaries, whether that's a city and counties, or region, will fall under the same consistent approach that we want to go about using to try to help people who are experiencing homelessness, as well as people who are at risk of homelessness, access housing related services. There's several core components to this. So the first one is including a housing first approach. So this idea that we look at people as being housing ready, We look at people as benefiting from individualized service planning, empowering choice, a recovery orientation, social and community integration. That we use real-time data, or as close to it as we could possibly get, about supply of and demand for housing resources. And we try to have a streamlined service approach. Now that has access points, so where people come into the system. It has a standardized workflow for triage and assessment, so how we go about looking at presenting needs and how we go about using that information. And I'll draw a distinction between triage and assessment and prioritization. Prioritization is a separate function. So whatever tool or approach you might be using for triage and assessment, prioritization is really a step beyond that information. And we look at vacancies in housing or vacancies in caseloads to be able to do matching and referral. So what is effective coordinated access? Well, we can look at this in two parts. Now, it has to be said that there are many communities from coast to coast to coast that see coordinated access primarily, and sometimes even exclusively, as filling the slots or openings that they have available in their homelessness housing programs. But while coordinated access does fill these openings, simply filling vacancies is not its primary purpose. Instead, we've got to see it as essential to creating a functioning homelessness and homelessness to housing response system that provides that standardized and accessible way in which people in need gain access to the system. That when people are trying to access the system, whenever it is safe and appropriate to do so, we look at prevention and diversion. And then if we're unable to be successful in our prevention and diversion efforts, we then go about assessing, prioritizing, and offering assistance. These processes should be clear, they should be transparent, they should be well understood across the entire system. So we don't want that knowledge just retained within a select few people within the community. We want it to be well understood across everybody who engages with the sector and is trying to provide solutions for housing and supports for the people that we're serving. Now, when we do this, we also want to be able to make sure that people are identified quickly, so that identification on the access side of things is happening relatively quickly, and then as rapidly as possible and in a coordinated manner, help people achieve a positive resolution to their homelessness. And many of the instances that we're talking about, these will be specific housing programs in your community, whether they are dedicated housing resources like supportive housing or place-based supportive housing, but can also include access to caseloads where a particular worker is endeavoring to find specific accommodation within the private market. So in terms of prioritization, we can look at what exactly we mean by that. So included here is the reaching home definition, which is, a little bit on the lengthy side of things in terms of going into detail. And then the OrgCode definition, which is essentially a summary of what's above. But let's dig into the reaching home definition just a little bit. So again, we're talking about clear process, right? So nothing that's ambiguous, nothing that's hidden behind closed doors, that is very clear in terms of how this happens. It does two things, right? It's going to connect program participants or clients or people in need of housing and supports with appropriate resources. So that's one, and we definitely should keep the people we serve at the center of what we do. At the same time, prioritization should help your community reach its goals. So those prioritization criteria are chosen by the community. They don't come from reaching home. They don't come from third parties like us. They come from the community itself. So the community, in terms of its approach, engagement, conversation, and agreement, has to get to a place where they agree what the prioritization criteria are. And then, based upon those local community priorities, we can go about putting together a rank order on a waiting list for housing resources. This becomes the priority list. By the time someone is on the priority list, we should have all of the information we need to have to be able to determine if that individual couple or family meets all of the criteria, has all the documentation in place, and gets to a place where they are imminently housable. So the way that it looks in prioritization is that people who meet most of the criteria, or a couple that meets most of the criteria, or a family that meets most of the criteria, are sorted closer to the top. But notice that it doesn't say, and then serve in descending acuity, or it doesn't say, and then work your way down the list. It talks about sorting close to the top. So I really think it's helpful to think about bands, right? Who meets all of your criteria? Who meets most of your criteria? Who reaches some of your criteria? Who reaches next to none of your criteria? Who realizes none of your criteria? When we do this well, we can be assured that people with deeper needs are going to be served relative to his, her, or their specific presenting issues and our understanding of those issues. That is, again, not just coming from a specific tool or instrument. That's the collection of all information relative to your community priorities. So why should we do this? We should do this so that local decisions really guide resource allocation on an agreed upon standardized process shared across the system. Once upon a time, this wasn't the case, as some of you will recall who have been in the field for a period of time. Before, it wasn't necessarily agreed upon standardized processes or criteria. There was no system function. Sometimes it was first come, first served. Sometimes it was luck. Sometimes it was personal advocacy. Sometimes it was a worker that advocated for you. We didn't have this clear and transparent process with agreed upon standardized approach. And when we start to think about, a process to triage and allocate resources, this is really no differently than thinking through the idea of a hospital emergency room, right? If we think about people who go to a hospital emergency room, perhaps yourself or a loved one at some point in your life, you come to appreciate that their determination of ordering of service is not based upon who came there first. It's based upon depth of need and availability of resource. It's why the person who has the heart attack is served ahead of the person who stubbed their toe, even though the person who stubbed their toe might have been waiting in the ER waiting room longer. And so at the end of the day, prioritization through coordinated access is going to allow us to look at the universe of what's available in terms of housing and supports, and to look at that very critically in terms of, if we don't have all the resources that we need, how do we allocate the limited options we have to the people that are best eligible, best matching our prioritization criteria, best in a position where all the documents are in order to be able to move into housing rapidly.
Great, thanks so much, Iain. So prioritization is included, just in terms of some expectations and further guidance, is included in question 13.3 of the Canadian Alliance Coordinated Access Scorecard, if you're using that. And there's further guidance and tips and resources included in the Coordinated Access Scorecard guide that accompanies the scorecard. At the reaching home level, for each type of housing resource in a community's resource inventory, communities should have documented their prioritization criteria and the order in which it will be applied. And in the spirit of continuous improvement, we're always working on continuous improvement. We've just offered, sort of a next level of thinking that if you are looking to fine tune your prioritization processes for different populations, to ensure that those are documented as well, and that you are thinking about how you come back and revisit those priorities on at least an annual basis. And I would say that the scorecard is ever evolving, and some of what we're going to be sharing today would probably further influence what additional elements might be included in basic and advanced scorecard elements in the future. I did also speak with our friends at Reaching Home, and they wanted to remind folks of the guidance offered in their Coordinated Access Guide and the Community Homelessness Report Reference Guide, and to really reiterate your intention of their requirements to create an effective coordinated access workflow that supports referrals to the most appropriate services and to confirm eligibility for those resources without unnecessary delays or asking clients to repeat their stories. And in terms of the directives, just to note that there is flexibility in the approach that communities can take. So communities can develop a common intake form for clients at the beginning of the process. This form can be supplemented with additional questions to gather the information needed for referrals and prioritization of housing resources, and that communities are responsible for selecting, those tools that work best for them, with the main idea being that these are common tools so that there's a shared approach to and understanding of people's depth of need, and that the questions and approaches used to conduct the assessment can be adjusted for specific populations. And again, kind of repeating what Iain said, beyond any assessment of a community, that other prioritization factors be taken into consideration that include but are not limited to length and history of homelessness, current sleeping arrangements, health status, vulnerability and victimization, household type, number of children and or pregnancy, youth, seniors, veterans, and Indigenous status. And that referrals made to housing services must be made based on your local documented prioritization policies and protocols that align with prioritization guidelines, with consideration for project-specific eligibility requirements such as age restrictions, geographic location, for example, and the specific needs and preferences of clients. And they also shared that they are open to hearing from communities about what's been working well and where they are facing challenges so that they can provide additional guidance and clarity as needed. And that if you have questions or comments, that you should be sharing these with your Service Canada representative. So I'll now turn it back to Iain to offer some clarity on different criteria and considerations within your prioritization, matching, and referral process.
And then we're really looking at 3 different buckets as we go through this. And we always start by looking at the person's needs and preferences. So when we're talking about serving that individual couple or family through our coordinated access system, we have to have some way of knowing what their specific preferences are. So these can be must-haves, nice-to-haves, cannot-haves, but we also need to know about needs. And when we start to think about needs, we can start to think about things like mobility, right? So perhaps the person uses a mobility assistance device, let's say a walker, they can't do stairs, or because of their walker, they need wider doorways or hallways. That might come into consideration. We also have to consider needs like transportation needs. Are they within proximity to where they can get access to a bus, let's say, if your community has public transit? So this person needs and preferences isn't always the strongest element in communities' coordinated access systems. We have to get some confirmation from people about their housing needs and preferences in order to support housing resource matching as well as finding. And one of the things included in the slides here today comes from Waterloo Region, used to prompt a discussion and collect information on people's housing needs and preferences, which may occur during or after intake onto the BNL. Second thing that we need to focus on is housing resource eligibility criteria. Now, when we talk about housing resource, we're really talking about a unit, a space, a subsidy, some level of case management support. And when we talk about eligibility, it is what is absolutely required. So not the nice to haves or we prefer to haves, but the stuff that is absolutely required. And these requirements often are an extension of the funding requirement, the funding agreement, or the program requirement. So that could dictate that a person has to have, or a couple or family has to have a certain type of presenting issue. It could also get to a point where, the building design is designed for a specific population group, or it may be that a certain level of support is required or a certain level of support cannot be required to move into. When we start to think about what this looks like, though, we need to map this out. And all of the eligibility criteria need to be documented. This is another example where we need transparency in the process of knowing what eligibility requirements are. To learn more about this, what's been linked in the slides is a housing resource inventory template and a couple of webinars for considerations. And then the last big bucket that I want to mention here is prioritization itself, the topic of our webinar today. And there's really two situations where it really becomes relevant to think about prioritization. The first, if you've got a housing resource or vacancy to fill, which could include a case manager having a spot on their caseload if it is an actual physical unit at the time, then we get to a place where we say, okay, based upon our community's prioritization criteria, things like their sleeping arrangements, length of homelessness, health status, equity considerations in the process, we go about prioritizing that particular person for that vacancy or spot on the caseload. But the second part of prioritization, which is sometimes overlooked, is of those people that you're currently working with. So we're not at the I'm trying to fill a vacancy stage. We're at the I'm working on making sure I've got a good quality by name list and moving from people on the list to being in a position where they're document ready. For those individuals that are either have a presentation of specific needs that makes it more difficult to engage, or where the engagement is taking longer and it's incremental, there might be information gaps that we need to fill in so that they can get to the priority list phase. We might also have some individuals where it's just about volume, right? There's so many people to get through from our by name list to the priority list that we have to think through, you know, what are the criteria that we're going to look at? Do we want to start with getting, you know, vulnerable seniors to a place where they're housing ready through documentation? I don't mean housing ready as in like behaviorally, I mean just in terms of documentation, or maybe there's a different population group that we really want to focus on. So outside of a vacancy to fill, use your prioritization criteria to prioritize which people you will focus on in the next steps of coordinated access. Like, who needs their assessment completed, or where do we need to still collect house needs and preferences, or where do we still need to get other supporting documentation in place? So when this gets put into action, you think through, you know what people want because you got their needs and preferences, you know what's open, and you know what your prioritization criteria is. This allows us to make sure that everything that flows from this point is still being driven by choice of the consumer rather than decisions by the system. I'll talk more about that in a few slides.
Great, thanks so much, Iain. And I see we have a question here asking for a link to some of the resources that are in here. So when we send out this slide deck in a PDF, you're going to have access to all of these resources and links, and we'll do that as quickly as possible so you can access all these things. But did just want to highlight some resources. So again, the Coordinated Access Scorecard Guide, there's a whole section on prioritization that includes the information on prioritization, links to the Reaching Home resources we've spoken about, as well as some of these resources. So previous webinar on the topic, I mentioned this at the beginning. So OrgCode, Iain had originally done one that was like the fundamentals of prioritization, which again, we're not going as deep into that today. And so if you're wanting that type of information, I encourage you to go back to that recording. There's a prioritization examples document. So there are 6 coordinated access community prioritization examples, each really providing different visualizations and approaches to prioritization. And I'm quite excited. The next community practice call that we do on December 9th is going to be on this topic. So hearing from these communities about how they've set up their prioritization, how it's working for them. So prioritization in practice. So we encourage you to join for that one. So now let's get into what we mean by dynamic prioritization, and starting by comparing and contrasting more static approaches to more dynamic approaches. And in general, dynamic means energetic, capable of action and or change, while static really means stationary or fixed. And we know that homelessness and our systems are constantly changing. So we need an approach that is focused on action and capable of change. I've included on this slide what I am calling the degrees of prioritization dynamicism. And starting with what I consider to be like super static prioritization. So an example of this is often an approach used by community social or affordable housing waiting lists, where there is often little understanding of the true need for affordable housing in the community. So, not everyone who's in need of affordable housing is necessarily on that list. It's really more based on who has elected to apply and to those who really have the wherewithal to complete the application and all of its requirements. There's often limited assessment of needs, interests, strengths, and vulnerabilities. The information tends to be, collected at the beginning and is updated infrequently, so often once or twice a year. And the way that gets updated is sometimes through a mail out. So if you don't receive or respond to that mail out, people are getting removed from the list. And typically when we look at the way prioritization occurs, it's largely on a first come, first served basis. And we know that all of these things really do not serve people experiencing homelessness well. Static prioritization is better than super static prioritization, is often, maybe where communities are getting started might land. So as you're starting into this process. So while you're starting to use more real-time data through a by name list that seeks to know more proactively everyone experiencing homelessness who has consented, there may be limited information gathered, and it may be done only once at the beginning of the process. Information might be gathered during an assessment, and that information then produces a static score that is used to place people on a community-wide priority list. People on the list are not necessarily updated or stayed in touch with, like you might know that they're still in the system, but do we know more about kind of their current situation and how it's evolving? So changes in circumstances are not revisited as much, and really this is at risk of becoming just another wait list. Where prioritization is overly reliant on an assessment score without consideration for other factors. And then even then, using a specific range of scores, people are slotted into waiting for a specific intervention type only, like rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing, sort of assuming that a single pathway out of homelessness, that there's only one way. People can then be left waiting for a specific resource to become available while other options aren't being considered. And so when someone's name finally maybe does come to the top of the list, it can be really difficult to locate them because the information provided during the assessment may no longer be valid. Their circumstances have changed. Maybe they don't have all of the information in order that they need to access that resource. So really, not only is this less than ideal at a person level, overall system performance can really be negatively impacted. So a potential solution to the challenge of static prioritization is dynamic prioritization. In a dynamic prioritization process, the changing needs of people and the shifting availability of resources are taken into account. And I think a really good example of this is, when COVID-19 hit, people kind of went back and reevaluated their systems as they were shifting and changing and how they were going to prioritize. So it's being responsive to that local context. For each vacancy, the by name list is sorted first by program eligibility and then by those with the highest prioritization based on your community's prioritization criteria, using up-to-date and complete data on the person's current situation, information needed to confirm and consider program eligibility and prioritization criteria, their needs and preferences. And at the same time, the community is continuing to integrate problem-solving conversations, both at access for rapid resolution, for prevention, diversion, and rapid rehousing, and through case conferencing to consider how all households can exit homelessness. So Iain, back over to you to further explain this.
Yeah, let's visually compare what a dynamic strategy looks like in comparison to a static approach. So in the static prioritization model, there's rigid and somewhat arbitrary lines that are established regarding who has access to specific intervention types. So in this example, persons with a score of 11 or above were prioritized for permanent supportive housing, even though resource availability only allowed persons with a score of 14 and above to actually be served in that resource. And those with a score between 5 and 10 were prioritized for rapid rehousing, again, even though the actual availability of that resource was not sufficient to serve the full cohort. And those that scored between 11 and 13 and 5 and 7 will continue to wait until the respective resource that they've been assigned to becomes available for them. And those that have the lowest level of need might be proactively assisted with referrals to community resources. So going back to our hypothetical model, let's look at how dynamic prioritization can play out. In this dynamic model, the scores are used for ordering the relative priority, but not for matching to an intervention type. So those at the highest priority based upon your local prioritization criteria will always be prioritized for whatever permanent supportive housing is available. However, you'll see that the arrows go back and forth between permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing, which signifies an acknowledgement that rapid rehousing could also be a good fit for some people with higher needs, and permanent supportive housing may be needed for a household within the prioritized group that has a relatively lower level of need. That'll be based upon specific criteria and situations. Let's look at how we get ready for dynamic prioritization. So we start with having a by name list, right? Our by name list, I'm not going to belabor that point today. I think we're all on the same page at this point of having by name lists, and certainly Built for Zero Team Canada has a lot of additional resources on by name lists. We also need to make sure that we have some continued engagement though on that by name list to make sure that we're accurate, we're filling in the blanks, we're getting people to a place where there's clear documentation required, is accessed and ready to go to get the individual couple or family into housing. Second up, we look at our housing resource inventory. So this is documenting all housing resources dedicated to coordinated access and all eligibility criteria. Now, on those all eligibility criteria, just to hammer this point home, if your community is still getting to the matching or case conference stage where you have a housing or service provider saying that someone isn't eligible, but that criteria was never noted anywhere transparently, that really has to be addressed. We want to eliminate in those case conferencings denying of service based upon eligibility mismatch. Third thing we need to do is have clear prioritization criteria. Groups that set priorities, not always the same group that does the matching. So what we need to do is be able to look at our local data, look at your specific goals, and stressing again, look at factors beyond a score. Finally, action-focused case conferencing. These are absolutely essential to focus on people of concern where we're not getting them to a place of engagement and documentation readiness, as well as those individuals with whom we are engaged in the matching and offer stage of the process. Marie?
That's great, thanks, Iain. So there are a number of things that Iain just mentioned that you need to have in place that are connected to your real-time by name list that are needed to be successful with dynamic prioritization. So just wanted to walk through these in a little bit more detail. So this idea that we are identifying people experiencing homelessness, we're adding, we're updating to the by name list, and that could be emergency shelters, drop-in meal programs, or outreach, particularly in communities where you have these dedicated resources. Where you don't have these dedicated resources, or in communities where you do, but you're leaning more deeply into your partners, you can look to income supports, libraries, food banks, health system, justice system, and other service providers to make sure that you're adding and updating to that by name list. And then on the other side of it, that housing resource inventory that we've been talking about. So this can be private market, social housing, affordable housing, it can be units, it can be shared spaces. It's any form of housing subsidy, RGI, housing allowance, other kinds of rent subsidies. And it includes housing help and case management support. So everything from working on a housing plan where for someone that might be more self-directed to more intensive case management, at an individual level to wrap around kind of supports. And so we can really see that the by name list is at the center of your homelessness response system, meaning that people experiencing homelessness are at the center of your homelessness response system. And that together, like, we need to coordinate our efforts to prioritize and problem solve through this entire process. And we're not going to spend a lot of time digging into this, but we also mentioned action-focused case conferencing. So there are some resources available here, a document that just provides an overview and some examples. There is a whole case conferencing tool bank that has been created by our friends at Community Solutions with webinars and tools, and it's just an amazing resource if you are looking to kick into high gear your action-focused case conferencing. We did a webinar that sort of summarized that tool and summarized this idea of action-oriented case conferencing. And there, just recently, we've added a case conferencing transformer roadmap. So kind of a checklist you can go through to say, hey, do I have these things in place? And if not, where are some resources I can connect to and put together a bit of a plan for yourself around making improvements? So Iain, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Right. So wanted to map out a bit of a workflow for considering the steps in the dynamic prioritization process, right? So we have these access points, outreach, engagement. We're connecting with people. We're getting people on the by name list. And when we get people on the by name list, they will have consented to the desire for services and housing. We may not have all their documentation ready. We may not have all their assessment ready, but then we move into that continuing engagement to add others onto the by name list and work on documentation. And so those action-focused case conferencings can be ongoing, right? So there's ongoing work to do, housing planning, referrals, filling in the blanks. When we have people to a position where their documentation is completed, we look at housing vacancies. Now, don't think of housing in this instance just as physical, permanent supportive housing. Housing vacancies can also include those programs where you have a specific case manager who is trying to find units in the private market, right? So the vacancy can be a caseload vacancy, or it can be a physical unit vacancy. We then filter the housing vacancies by eligibility requirements, right? So if it's a specific physical unit, let's say in a permanent supportive housing building, which populations do they serve? What eligibility criteria need to be met? If it is a spot on a case management program where they're going to find the unit in the private market, we've got to know what the eligibility requirements are for the case management program. We then, and this is a step that is sometimes missed, filter our by name list for people that meet the eligibility criteria. So there's a bit of a cart and a horse issue here, right? Where some communities filter the by name list and then try to match vacancies, but you should really filter your housing vacancies, then filter your by name list data. Filter those that match eligibility into priority sequence based upon the community criteria as we talked about. And then you're going to see an action-oriented case conference again. This is for people that meet eligibility criteria and meet prioritization criteria. Now, when I say again, it could be part of the same action-oriented case conference. It could be a separate action-oriented case conference. But this idea that matching isn't static either, that matching is dynamic. We have the viewing or the offer of housing, with support is warranted based upon the specific needs of the individual couple or family. And then I really want to highlight this point because it's sometimes forgotten: program participant choice. We don't place people in housing. We present offers of housing based upon those match criteria. But that individual couple or family still has the ability to say, no, I don't want that specific unit that's available, without there being punishment or denial of services or anything negative happening to them. Then we have to take care of all the administrative requirements. If housing is selected by the prioritized program participant, like lease signing, we then have to take care of pre-move-in preparation. So, everything from furniture to working on changes of address to, where people might have to get their medications moved to a different part of the community, those sorts of things. The actual move-in itself, pretty exciting times. And then support, customized to the unique needs of the individual, whether that's through referral or direct service supports. And that support must focus on social and community integration. So when we think about those housing first approach elements being talked about in the definition from Reaching Home, one of those core principles of Housing First is social and community integration. We don't want to miss out on the need to assist people, not just in being in housing, but starting to feel as a member of a supported community where they have social outlets, where they are feeling more integrated with where they live. So in general, people who are chronically homeless and have the highest vulnerability should be offered permanent supportive housing when it's available. We know from research that permanent supportive housing is the most effective and cost-effective approach when it's used to serve chronically homeless households who have been homeless the longest and have the most severe service needs. We also know that in many communities, there are more people experiencing chronic homelessness than there are supportive housing vacancies. In these situations, rapid rehousing or other resources should be offered. This will require rapid rehousing to be designed more flexibly so that it can assist any household. In addition, the community will need to consider the level of services offered in rapid rehousing and potentially enhance those services to better ensure success for those with higher needs and a less intensive intervention. While rapid rehousing may ultimately not be enough in the long term for persons experiencing chronic homelessness or who are particularly vulnerable, it can be used as a bridge to permanent supportive housing for those populations. And this type of assistance, when implemented, is usually available for up to 24 months. For this reason, you could definitely use an intensive case management model through a rapid rehousing program over those 18 to 24 months to see if stability is a possibility, or to learn more about how to make a transition to permanent supportive housing. Households at the top of the priority list should always be considered first, regardless of the resource type. Decisions about who should be referred to what resource should take into consideration factors such as the household's level of need in relation to others in the group, preferences, and appropriateness of the vacant resources. In other words, for each opening, the community would refer the household that meets the eligibility for the program and is the highest priority or has the highest level of need, that they're willing to accept the offer, and for whom there aren't considerations that would make the matching inappropriate, such as specific health or safety concerns. If the highest need household is not ready or interested in that specific opening, it can be offered to the next household. So when we start to look at the process used to select prioritization criteria, there's different approaches to doing this at the community level, but the most common that we have been part of starts with looking at your data to determine the pressure points within the system, and this information being shared with a larger group of the community that will be part of selecting the prioritization criteria. So we don't want that to be just held by a service manager or community-based organization. We want that data to be shared with people who have a direct voice in determining the prioritization for specific population groups. Now, for each of those population groups, singles, families, youth, and survivors of domestic and intimate partner violence, each person that you've collected around the table in your community brainstorms all the variables that they think should be considered for prioritization, like chronic homelessness, or their length of homelessness, or the frequency of service use. Sometimes things like age come into it, in things like, some youth services, it looks at aging out of foster care. Other communities have equity considerations. Each person then tries to rank their own top 5. So you start with brainstorming, you look at your own work, you decide prioritize-wise, which of those 5 make the most sense to you. And then we start to share that as a community with each other. As we share it as a community with each other, we can use a weighted point system to then figure out where the community as a whole is landing. So if your first place vote is worth 5 points, second place vote worth 4 points, third gets 3, fourth gets 2, fifth gets 1, it's really clear around that table where the dominant ideas of prioritization are shared across different service providers and entities in your community once we tally up those figures. So when you do this, you can start to look at not just one priority list, this dynamic, but at least 6 and maybe 8. So we would have our priority list in place for singles, for youth, and families. We can further look at that by rapid rehousing and supportive housing. So who are the sort of households that we're looking for in each of these? Keeping in mind that we might start someone in a rapid rehousing intervention that could be entirely appropriate and help them work through a transition to supportive housing over time. But as we start to think about things like unattached adults, youth, families as separate groups, the prioritization criteria for families can be different and in no way in competition with youth. And the criteria established for youth are separate and apart and not in competition with unattached individual adults. When we start to look at this, and your community may or may not have partnership and engagement with service providers who assist survivors of domestic or intimate partner violence, if you do, you can establish criteria for that population group as well. If not, focusing on singles, youth, and families should be sufficient. And I've used, and I think Marie has also used, the rapid rehousing concept. It is an important part of our service delivery makeup system. We want to make sure that communities don't just put all of the eggs into the most intensive support bucket and think that everything is like permanent supportive housing, to look at a broad range of housing options for people, predominantly, though not exclusively, in the private market, that allow people to also access housing based upon his, her, or their presenting needs. As we head to the final stretch, we'll look at cautions and considerations with prioritization. Make it about the people you serve.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, we have like 3 slides here that kind of summarize some of what we've been talking about, but just to kind of sort of bring those points home.
Start with the people you serve. Prioritization happens whether you plan for it or not, but good prioritization includes criteria chosen with those inputs across the community, with an examination of data that's aligned to your community goals and is documented, transparent, and clear. If you don't actually establish priorities, you don't have any. And if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. Keep in mind, Reaching Home has some clear priorities as well, like reductions in chronic homelessness. One of the things that we would look for in most communities is, how is your approach to prioritization meeting an objective like reductions in chronic homelessness? Make sure that those eligibility criteria and prioritization requirements are clear and transparent and readily available and shared. If you still have side doors, they've got to be closed. That's access to the likes of PSH outside, or permanent supportive housing outside the coordinated access process. Trying to prioritize people for vacancies when they're not immediately available or don't meet eligibility criteria is definitely something that your community has to be staying on top of. Make sure that you're not looking at eligibility factors too late in the process. In fact, filter by eligibility before you filter your by name list. Make sure that we look at population groups not as being in competition with each other. So that's important. Make decisions at case conferencing based upon the actual clear criteria. A caution that decisions should not be based just upon the butts in the seat and who talks the loudest. And make sure that we are truly doing our due diligence on what is an eligibility criteria and what is actually a preference of the service provider. And finally, to summarize, in cautions and considerations, you got to keep your information up to date. You have to have as close to real-time supply of your understanding of how much housing supply is available. So having an understanding of who's on your by name list, what housing is actually available is going to be necessary for making the match. Look for opportunities for adjustment and be dynamic in that space, making sure that you have at least an annual review of your prioritization criteria and prioritization process. Make sure that also you don't just give in and check all of your great work on coordinated access out the window because of political pressure. And if it ain't working for you, then you got to make some changes. Don't do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. Keep focus on what you need to fix as a system rather than thinking that you need to fix people. Remember, our job is not to change people to meet programs, but to change programs to meet the needs of people.
Amazing, thanks, Iain. And I'm sort of reflecting on some, policies that people have shared with us, recently, and they sort of say prioritization criteria, like we keep these 5 factors in consideration and we talk about them at the table. And, you just spoke about, making sure that they're clear and transparent and they can be ordered. Like we're looking for more in those guides or those policies and protocols than just sort of a listing of some things you're considering. Because then I think it can really get back to bums and seats and who's talking the loudest when it's not more clearly identified. We have some great questions in here. I do just want to remind people of this upcoming webinar. And again, we'll be sending this information out and you can link into this presentation to get access to all the materials we've talked about. We are now going to have a bit of time just for questions and discussion. And I'm going to go back to question, can we get any information on the research that proves permanent supportive housing is the best model? And when I send the follow-up to this webinar, I will send you a rapid research piece that one community did on housing first and encampments that you may find helpful. But Iain, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I definitely check out the Corporation for Supportive Housing website. I believe it's csh.org. They are definitely leaders on the American side in supportive housing, and they have a large volume of research that they often make accessible to people relative to the value of looking at permanent supportive housing in comparison to other models. Great.
And we have a question about, talking about the process of setting up your prioritization criteria. Who gets to vote, for example, if you've got an agency around the table that has many programs and different pieces to it, do they still get one vote? Just sort of speaking to that process.
This has definitely got to be part of the terms of reference and that are established for your community to engage in the prioritization process. In terms like I wouldn't have them come and just spring it on them that, oh, by the way, you get one vote, and to think about it deliberately. I personally believe that each agency gets to a place of having one vote because it's a community process. However, in the sort of example that you described, where you have one provider who is got a pretty decent sized footprint in terms of what they do in the community, you may get to places that you say that they're weighted votes. In terms of moving forward, it's certainly a lot easier if it's one organization, one vote, and we all come together, especially if there's overlap in the population served. Again, let's center it on the people who use services, not the providers of those services.
That's great, thank you. We have a comment in here just sort of reflecting on, the challenge when there isn't enough resources put into housing first. It's hard to address that sort of priority on chronic homelessness. Particularly not funding housing on First Nation communities, which then leads people to migrate into cities and that sort of thing. Iain, I don't know if you have any comments on that or thoughts.
I think Betty's bang on.
Yeah. We have another question. What is the definition of rapid rehousing? In that, what is the standard of care given? And Iain, maybe speaking a little bit to what might you see different in rapid rehousing than what you might see in a housing first ICM program.
Yeah, so a few things. One, it's always time limited. So there's no permanent rapid rehousing programs. So we think of it as a bit of clock is ticking from time of program entry to help the individual couple or family reach a place of stability. While not used exclusively for households with more moderate needs, that is often the way that it is used or targeted in communities. As a starting point anyway. The intervention, like the naming of the intervention, rapid rehousing, is very American. There's been a number of Canadian programs in different parts of the country over time that maybe didn't have that kind of language attached to it. But just think of it as short term, often with a shallow subsidy, though not exclusively with a shallow subsidy. And from a support perspective, if you were thinking about like, individuals, couples or families you were serving that had really deep needs, where you'd be trying to see them, let's say 2 or 3 times a week to provide support. Rapid rehousing has higher caseloads. So in the US context, it's usually 1 to 25 or 1 to 30, with an expectation that you see people, depending upon how long they've been in the rapid rehousing program, once a week or once every 2 weeks. And some rapid rehousing programs some rapid rehousing programs really focus on the flexibility that can be offered.
So someone just asked CHS, so it's the Corporation for Supportive Housing if you're looking for that website. So it would be csh.org. So Iain, how do you prioritize when clients overlap with the priority criteria?
Well, I need that untangled a little bit.
I think, what that says to me a little bit is like you've sorted to a certain point, but perhaps you don't have enough detail in your prioritization criteria. You might still end up with 20 people when you need to get it down to, 1 to 3 people that you're trying to figure out who to make the offer to.
Yeah, I mean, generally, the number of people on the by name list seems to have a direct relationship to the number of criteria you need to establish for priorities. So if you have hundreds of people on your list, you'll probably need more people to filter down, or more criteria to filter down, than if you had, let's say, 100 or less people on your list. And certainly once you get to like less than 50, even fewer prioritization criteria are required. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, in terms of the dynamic nature of the list, if we still have 20 people on the list, we have to make sure that all 20 would meet the eligibility criteria. And we likely have had community conversations, not just about what our prioritization criteria are, but what's the most important of our prioritization criteria. So let's say we said chronic homelessness was more important than any of our other prioritization criteria. Well, we use that as the tiebreaker. So when you're thinking about those bands of people meeting or not meeting, as opposed to descending acuity of score, that's where you have the flexibility.
And I'm going to answer a couple of questions like super quickly here, because I know we're running out of time, and I will take all of these questions, and perhaps Iain, you and I over email can just answer them. When we send out the materials, we can make sure some of these questions are answered if we're not getting to them. But how do you manage people's choice for options against one right of refusal for RGI units, once is happening in some provinces? I mean, that's a great example of not having dynamic prioritization. I think the prioritization we're speaking of, people have the chance to say no as many times as they want, and we're going to keep coming back when they're prioritized and offering, the resource to them again when it's available. So I would say that. Someone asked about HIFIS and its capacity to match people. So you can definitely include an inventory in HIFIS, but the matching capability isn't super strong right now. It is a list, it's on a list of things to do to continually improve HIFIS. So that's what I'll say about that one. And the shift from dynamic from static to dynamic, like how much time does it take to collect that information? And I would say it does take more time. And sometimes part of your prioritization, even in the collection of information, you might need to prioritize how you're going to organize your resources to do that additional data collection so that you can have that good information. Iain, any final thoughts to wrap us up today?
Just to say, this is also a dynamic process amongst those of you who are in the space of figuring out everything with coordinated access, and you likely will continue to unearth more questions, more comments, but also more gems, more magic, more things that really sing. Sharing those success stories of how you resolved some issues in your coordinated access is going to help us better as a country do this work.
That's great. Thank you everyone very much for joining us today. And as I said, I'll be sending all of this information out to you in the next couple of days. Have a great rest of your week. Thanks, Iain.
Bye now.
Bye.